Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. And thank you to the Veterans Memorial Museum for the opportunity to speak here today. Now, some of you may be wondering how a Civil War regiment fits the museum's theme of the 250th anniversary of America's founding. The poem on the screen offers some clues. It appeared in the Johnstown Tribune in April of 1861, and it reflects many ideals that the soldiers of the American Revolution would be able to identify with. There's patriotism. There's dedication to a cause, even if it may seem impossible to achieve at times. But most importantly, there's country. Lines like, "United we stand, divided we fall," or "The flag of our Union, forever," would resonate with the patriots of 1776. They also explain the motives for many of the early Union volunteers from Johnstown, whose experiences early in the war resembled those of their Revolutionary forefathers. Like many places north and south, the residents of Johnstown knew war was coming by the spring of 1861. President Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 led to 7 states in the Deep South seceding from the Union. The slave states of the Upper South waited to see how the federal government responded. Between November of 1860 and April of 1861, both North and South prepared for a war everybody knew was on its way. Some stockpiled weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Others sought one more chance at compromise that might keep our country together. Most recruited men into the local militia companies and waited for their government or their state to call. Johnstown was not different. The men wanted to be ready to answer their country's call as members of the 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry whenever it may come. They didn't have to wait long. The much anticipated conflict arrived on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Johnstown Tribune's headline screamed, "The war has commenced." The staff wrote, quote, "It but remains therefore for the federal government to vindicate its defied authority for the men who love the Union, which has thus been assailed, and revere the flag, which has thus been insulted and abused, to rally to its support and put down the rebels. The war, having been inaugurated by the slavery propagandists of the South, let the freemen of the North, forgetting everything else, respond to their challenge to the tented field and show them the Union must and shall be preserved," end quote. While the editors acknowledged the root cause of slavery, the first and last lines reflect the primary motivation for many Union volunteers early in the war: the federal government to vindicate its defied authority, or the Union must and shall be preserved. Many Northern volunteers marched off to war in 1861 not to free anybody, but to preserve the country and government established by their Revolutionary forefathers. Over the next several days, the Johnstown Tribune continued to write articles lamenting the start of war, but drawing back to the ideals of patriotism. One article stated, "The crisis so long dreaded by every true patriot." Another wrote, "The day of suspense truly agonizing to every patriotic heart." Jacob Campbell, a leading figure in the town, took the calls for patriotism to his heart. After learning of the attack on Fort Sumter, he rushed back to his home on the corner of Walnut and Lincoln Street, where the First Presbyterian Church is today, just a few blocks from where we're at. Campbell went to a window on the upper story, unfurled a large American flag, and hung it from the peak of his home. He then resigned his position at the Cambria Iron Company, not wanting to miss the opportunity to serve his country in its hour of need. President Lincoln and the federal government, meanwhile, also responded. On April 15th, 3 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln issues Proclamation 80, calling for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. The proclamation set regimental quotas based on state population. You can see in the graph, Pennsylvania was required to furnish 30,000 troops for 15 regiments of 780 men each. Interestingly, the proclamation also called for the slave states to furnish regiments. Kentucky, Missouri, Virginia, Arkansas, which have not yet seceded, also have a quota to meet. Needless to say, they failed to meet those quotas. Several of the slave states in the Upper South looked at Lincoln's call for troops as an act of aggression, and they seceded to join the Confederacy. Both sides believed that the war would be short. One big battle, their side wins, and they get to come home battlefield heroes. The first federal volunteers signed 3-month enlistments for 90 days. The wave of enthusiastic volunteers quickly overwhelmed the recruiting stations, and many of the states easily met these quotas, many having to turn away eager volunteers. While the state organized the new recruits, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin called for the existing militia companies to report to Harrisburg and muster into federal service. Johnstown had several militia companies prior to the outbreak of Civil War. The Johnstown Infantry was commanded by Captain Thomas Lapsley, and First Lieutenant was Jacob Campbell. Captain Callahan recruited the Johnstown Citizen Guards. He could not accompany them to Harrisburg. They will be led by Captain John Linton. And Captain John M. Power recruited the Johnstown Zouave Cadets. They will be led by Captain John Sutter after mustering into federal service. On April 19th, all 3 companies will meet at their respective armories in Johnstown to prepare to depart for Harrisburg. They also looked for a few more recruits to try and fill out their companies before they left. Several of the militia companies that made up the 3rd Pennsylvania wore Zouave-style uniforms. Prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, towns and cities had multiple militia groups. Some modeled their uniforms after the Zouaves of the French Foreign Legion. It was very popular at the time to model uniforms after powerful nations' successful militaries. Others used the flashier Zouave uniform as a recruitment tool. If you are recruiting and competing with other militia companies in your same town, a flashier uniform could be more attractive than your regular federal issued uniform. But if you look at the screen, there is a variety of uniforms in the militia groups that will make up the regiments of the companies in the 3rd Pennsylvania. Company K's Private Evan Thomas, on the left-hand side of the screen, was a member of the Johnstown Zouave Cadets. Robert Martin was from Hollidaysburg, and he served in Company A and wore the uniform that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, my friend Gabe is back in the room there. He has worked tirelessly to research and recreate the model of the uniform of Company A. But if you notice, the recruits and their uniforms lacked any uniformity, just like the early Continental Army. In the afternoon of April 19th, the citizens of Johnstown met at Town Hall to bid goodbye to their volunteers. 2 young women presented each Johnstown company with a flag that Colonel Campbell received. The newspapers remarked that Campbell's speech was filled with patriotic rhetoric. When the rally ended, the citizens of Johnstown refused to go home. Most stayed for a final goodbye and witnessed, quote, many a touching scene in the hours before the arrival of the train. Many a Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted. Many a dashing Zouave or gallant member of the infantry taking a last kiss from the cheek of the girl he loved. Many a husband and father brushing away a tear for the wife and children from whom the most sternest of all manly duties required him to part. To the honor of the wives and mothers and sisters and daughters of our town, we heard no one of them say, stay, to their husband or father, the brother or son, who responded to their country's call for help in their hour of need, end quote. From Town Hall, the companies marched to Cambria House for a quick meal. Brass bands paraded through the streets playing patriotic music, and the crowd accompanied the recruits to the train station for a final farewell. On April 20th, Captain Lapsley's Johnstown Infantry is the first company to arrive in Camp Curtin in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The other Johnstown companies arrived the same day and are some of the first to reach the state capital. At Camp Curtin, they will join 6 companies from Blair County and 1 company from Allegheny County to form the 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry. The 3rd Pennsylvania will be commanded by Colonel Francis Munier. Captain Power is promoted to Lieutenant Colonel of the 3rd Pennsylvania, so that's when Captain John Sutter will then take command of Company F, and Lieutenant Jacob Campbell is made quartermaster for the entire regiment. The same day they mustered into service, the regiment is ordered to report to Baltimore, Maryland, in response to the attack on the 6th Massachusetts. The day before, on April 19th, which coincidentally also happened to be the anniversary of Lexington and Concord, the 6th Massachusetts arrived at President Street Station in Baltimore on a train from Philadelphia. And if you look at the map, President Street Station is in the lower right-hand corner there. Some of the members of the 6th Massachusetts are descendants from the Minutemen of 1776. During the time, there is no direct rail connection with Washington, D.C. Anybody wanting to travel to the nation's capital had to first go to Baltimore and then walk several blocks across town to Camden Station, which is on the far left of the screen here. Pro-Confederate crowds learned of the arrival of the 6th Massachusetts, and they start to gather in the streets. The first 7 companies will be transported in the railroad cars from President Street Station to Camden Station. The crowds continue to grow louder. They're yelling death threats at the men of the 6th Massachusetts. They're threatening violence. Some start barricading the railroad tracks, and they start attempting to tear up the bridge that goes over the canal in the picture there next to President Street Station. The last 4 companies of the 6th Massachusetts are forced to disembark from the railroad cars and march through the city on foot. The crowd has grown larger and more violent. The rioters start throwing rocks and bricks at the members of the 6th Massachusetts. Several shots are fired. 5 members of the 6th Massachusetts will be killed or mortally wounded, 36 injured. 1 company of the 6th Massachusetts returns fire. They eventually make their way to the railroad station at Camden Yards, will board some cars, but the crowd doesn't go away. They're threatening to set the cars on fire. They're ripping up cobblestones and throwing them at the train. Some of the soldiers aboard the train are firing out the windows. 12 civilians are going to be killed. When word spreads of the Baltimore City riots, the 6th Massachusetts immediately earns the nickname the Minutemen of 61. And you can see from this lithograph that Currier and Ives produces shortly after event, they called the incident the Lexington of 1861, referring back to the, no, thanks. Referring back to that common heritage. The 3rd Pennsylvania does not have time to organize, to get food or supplies before leaving for Baltimore. One soldier in the 3rd PA will write from the train, "We have no provisions except such as the men brought with them in their haversacks, which are now about run out. Our ammunition is scarce, as we were not fully provided for before we left Harrisburg." The regiment never makes it to Baltimore. The mayor of Baltimore decided to burn several of the railroad bridges outside of the town to prevent any more federal troops from marching through the city and hopefully stop any more violence. The 3rd PA will spend several days camped along the Gunpowder River north of the city near Cockeysville, Maryland. You can see it here on the map. On a series of hills overlooking the city of Baltimore, the 3rd Pennsylvania feared an attack by Confederate forces. There's rumors of Confederate cavalry in the area. Some were concerned that the rioters will actually come out of the city and attack the 3rd Pennsylvania. Compounding their concern, the men have on average only about 5 cartridges each. So if they are attacked, they're not going to be able to put up much resistance. Fortunately, an attack never comes. On April 22nd, orders arrived for the 3rd Pennsylvania to move to Camp Scott in York, PA. Their officers will finally have time to organize the regiment and start drilling the raw recruits. Still, there are no supplies or uniforms, just like the poorly supplied American Continentals of the Revolution. The war started, and it quickly overwhelmed the ability of the state and federal governments to supply all of those volunteers. A soldier in the 3rd Pennsylvania will write, "Many of the men are becoming dissatisfied in the long delay in furnishing their outfits. It is now half a month since they were sworn in, and they are not yet supplied." A month later, on May 27th, the 3rd PA is ordered to Chambersburg to join Major General Robert Patterson's Department of Pennsylvania. When they arrive in Chambersburg, the 3rd PA is brigaded with the 1st and 2nd Pennsylvania Infantry and Brigadier General George Wincoop's 2nd Brigade, part of Major General William Kimes' 2nd Division. The drilling will continue in Chambersburg at the company, regiment, brigade, and division levels. General Patterson is a fellow Pennsylvanian. He has some military experience, having fought in the Mexican-American War, and with the outbreak of our Civil War, is appointed to command the Department of Pennsylvania by Governor Andrew Curtin, despite the fact he has never commanded an army that large. His experience is mostly at the brigade and division levels. General Patterson will move his army by rail to Hagerstown, Maryland. Hagerstown is at the top of this map. The men will depart their train in Hagerstown and then march on foot to Funkstown. Funkstown is where the arrow is, just a few miles south of Hagerstown. This location is strategically important, and it's in response to a continued Confederate presence at Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is at the bottom of the map here. Colonel Thomas Jackson has occupied Harper's Ferry since April, when Virginia seceded. He's busy recruiting more men for the Confederacy, training those recruits, and attacking the strategically important B&O Railroad. The B&O Railroad is the only railroad that links the Midwestern states with the Eastern states. And it's going to be vital in the transportation of men and supplies for the Union war effort. Having soldiers in Funkstown also enables them to protect the fort at Williamsport and try and guard that railroad. The men will camp along Antietam Creek and continue drilling. At Funkstown, the 3rd Pennsylvania will suffer their first deaths in the service. Both are from Blair County companies. The first is mortally wounded by an accidental gunshot. The other dies from a camp disease. General Patterson will also receive some reinforcements while he's at Funkstown. A regiment from Wisconsin and another from Connecticut, as well as several hundred U.S. regulars, will join his growing army. It brings the total number of soldiers under his command up to about 18,000 men of all arms. By the end of June, many of the men in the 3rd PA knew that their enlistments are nearing an end. One soldier will write from Funkstown, "Our boys begin to fear that they will not have the pleasure of seeing an armed foe before the 3-month term is up." While the 3rd PA fretted on missing the war, President Lincoln and his generals were busy planning the first major campaign. General Patterson and his army will have an important part to play in the overall Union strategy. Patterson is expected to move his 18,000 men into Northern Virginia, recapture Harper's Ferry, and protect the B&O Railroad. They are also hoping that a Union presence in Northern Virginia will hold Confederate forces in the Shenandoah Valley and prevent them from joining the growing Confederate army at Manassas under General P.G.T. Beauregard. That Confederate army at Manassas is the objective of the main Union army forming in Washington, D.C. under General Irvin McDowell. General Patterson has orders to be very cautious. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott tells him right before he leaves, "Sustain no reverse, but that is not enough. A checked or drawn battle would be a victory to the enemy." So it is very, very clear that there is no expectation that General Patterson gets himself involved in a battle. So what do you think he does? That's exactly what he's going to do. Find himself engaged with some Confederates. General Patterson's army moves to Williamsport, Maryland on July 1st and starts crossing the Potomac River into Virginia the next day. His leading brigade will bump into Confederates under Colonel Thomas Jackson, who are positioned along a small stream called Oaks Run, just a few miles north of Martinsburg. The Union will deploy for battle, and they start driving back the Confederate forces. The 3rd Pennsylvania is approximately in the middle of the marching column. They're heading south down the Williamsport Pike here on the map, and they can hear the sounds of the battle. A courier arrives for General Wynkoop with news that the Union forces are engaged with about 3,000 Confederates and 2 guns of artillery in support. Company K, the Johnstown Zouaves, overhears the courier telling General Wynkoop. They are in the lead of the 3rd Pennsylvania and are eager to finally fight in a battle. So they immediately start double-quicking towards the sound of the fighting. There's just one problem. They left the rest of their regiment behind. They are that eager. One of General Wynkoop's aides overtakes Company K, admonishes the men, admonishes Captain Sutter for letting them get ahead of the rest of the regiment, and orders them to stay on the Valley Pike. For 15 agonizing minutes, Private William Eldridge will later write, "We remained about a quarter of an hour listening to the thunder of the cannon, the explosion of the shells, and anxiously looking for our regiment. When they came within hailing distance, we started off again." So they don't even wait for the regiment to join up with them. As soon as they can see them, they take off for the battlefield. Company K and the rest of the 3rd Pennsylvania arrived just as Confederates retreated in the face of overwhelming numbers. Colonel Jackson never intended to fight a pitched battle. He had orders to just keep an eye on Union troop movements, and when he sees that he's outnumbered, orders his men to fall back to Winchester. General Patterson's army follows the retreating Confederates to Martinsburg, Virginia the next day. They will stop and set up camp north of town. General Patterson is worried about the lengthening supply lines. The farther south he moves in pursuit of Colonel Jackson, the farther away he is from his base of supply back in Williamsport. So while they are sitting in camp, hoping to engage the Confederates one more time, an order arrives for the 3rd Pennsylvania, detaching them from the army to guard the supply line back to Maryland. On July 15th, General Patterson follows Colonel Jackson's retreating army to Bunker Hill, Virginia, and then he stops. Remembering his orders from General Scott, and still concerned about his lengthening supply lines, General Patterson remains in Bunker Hill. This delay allows the Confederates to escape the Shenandoah Valley. You can see on this map, they're going to take a train to Manassas Junction. Their arrival contributes to Confederate victory at First Bull Run and earns Colonel Jackson his immortal nickname of Stonewall. The 3rd PA's enlistments will expire on July 26th. The regiment is discharged from federal service in Harrisburg 3 days later. Confederate victory at Bull Run convinced the North that the war would not be short. It's not going to be one quick battle and we get to go home heroes. President Lincoln issues a call for volunteers to serve, this time for 3 years. On the train back to Johnstown, the 3rd PA veterans start talking of re-enlisting. Their idealistic view of war is gone. For 90 days, the men experienced the reality of military service, from inadequate supplies and food to the boredom of drill. They also saw men die, first in the camps, then in the aftermath of the Battle of Hoke's Run. Many of the veterans of the 3rd PA are not frightened away by the dangers and hardships. Men in Captain Linton's company will vow, quote, "Whereas the President has made a requisition on the Governor of Pennsylvania for volunteers to aid in enforcing the law, preserving the Union, and upholding the flag of our country, we, therefore, the members of the Citizens' Guards, hereby promise and agree to tender the service of our company to the Governor for the said purpose, and each of us individually promise to go when called upon to any place where we may be ordered by proper authorities," end quote. A crowd called the largest multitude of people we ever saw in Johnstown met the returning veterans at the train station. Johnstown companies will be paraded through streets under 3 arches made of evergreens. The bands are playing patriotic music, welcoming them back home. Flags are flying, people are throwing flowers. There's photos of patriotic Americans hanging from the homes. The returning veterans from the 3rd Pennsylvania will form the nucleus of the 54th Pennsylvania. Jacob Campbell will meet with Governor Curtin before coming back home to Johnstown. When he returns home, he has a commission as a colonel, an authorization to raise a regiment to answer President Lincoln's call for 3-year enlistments. His service as quartermaster of the 3rd PA prepared him for the realities of military service and supplying his troops. There is an incident while he is quartermaster of the 3rd Pennsylvania that really reflects Colonel Campbell's character. At the end of May, with the regiment camped at Chambersburg, Campbell, on his own initiative, will leave the regiment and travels to Pittsburgh. He collected money through donations, advances on the soldiers' pay, possibly a loan. He refused to say how he got the money. That wasn't important to him. When he returned to the 3rd PA, Campbell used the money that he raised to buy food and medicine, clothing, for the people under his command. Some of the money is even sent home to the soldiers' families. Their husbands, their fathers, they resigned their positions in the mills and the mines. His families had no money. The soldiers hadn't been paid yet. In Colonel Campbell, the 54th Pennsylvania will have an officer who cares about their well-being more than he does about making a name for himself. John Linton will re-enlist and serve as Major of the 54th Pennsylvania. He's later promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and will lead the regiment and was wounded 3 times in 1864. Thomas Lapsley, John Sutter, William Bonneker, all members of the 3rd Pennsylvania, will raise and lead companies in the new 54th Pennsylvania. Other 3rd PA veterans will fill the ranks of enlisted men and NCOs to follow these experienced officers. This chart will show you the breakdown of the 3rd Pennsylvania companies and the number of men that then re-enlisted in the 54th. There were other veterans from the 3rd PA who served in different units. Some had tired of the infantry and will join the artillery and the cavalry. Others did not want to serve for 3 years. You'll see a large number of 3rd Pennsylvania veterans volunteering to serve in the 1863 emergency militia when Lee is on his way to Gettysburg. One of the more well-known individuals from Johnstown is Powell Stackhouse, a veteran of the 3rd PA who will serve as a lieutenant in the 133rd Pennsylvania, a 9-month regiment, and then eventually rises to the rank of major in the 198th PA. Stackhouse Park is named after him. These veterans will be joined by those without prior service. Companies from Somerset, Lehigh, and Dauphin counties will enlist to fight in the 54th. Regardless of their background, all still believed and were determined to preserve the country and its institutions. Lieutenant William H. Rose, serving as adjutant of the 54th Pennsylvania, reflected on the men in his new regiment, writing, "Mingled with us are the lively, chivalrous Irishmen who fight nobly, bravely in any other but their own native land. The stern, valiant Germans who are ever ready to strike a blow for freedom. The self-reliant Englishmen and the blithe Welshmen. Combining as we do the impetuosity of the French with the stubborn valor of the English and German troops, I feel fully satisfied to venture my prediction that when the tug comes, the 54th will do its work with the will." People from all over Europe came to America and are willing to fight for American democracy and American freedoms to ensure their survival and in hopes that one day they may spread back to their homelands. Nothing more can reflect the America the patriots of 1776 wanted to create. One where all are welcome. That's what the Revolutionary soldier fought for and the Civil War soldier protected. I'd like to thank you for coming out today. Feel free to browse the displays, talk with any of the uniformed reenactors. For those of you that are interested, it is in the brochure as well, but I do have a book coming out later this year on the 54th Pennsylvania. My talk is the prologue of the book. I also have QR codes to the blog that I write and a series of videos that I've done called In the Footsteps of the 54th. But thank you again. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Can you have them stand up front so we can all see what?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
You're reading our minds.